evening to all the SHRs and SANParks friends. Thank you for joining us tonight at the SHR at Home. Goeienaand aan al ons veldwagters en SANParks vriende wat almal vanaand saam met ons by SHR at Home kuier. And it is a pleasure to introduce Dr. Louise Swemmer tonight from SANParks, where she is employed as a social and economic resource scientist. Welcome to you, Louise. Wishing we could all be with you in the bush tonight. Before I hand over to Louise, here's some background on her. With both a passion for nature and love of people, conservation social science was the obvious career choice for Louise, who works for the South African National Parks. Louise coordinates applied research on conservation relation, benefit sharing, and relationship building, mostly adjacent to the Kruger National Park. She's specifically interested in the positive and negative impacts of conservation on human well-being. Louise, together with a team of SANParks College, work closely with people living adjacent to the Kruger Park and on the diversity issues which are included in the wildlife, human-wildlife conflict, as well as sustainable resource use and the community engagement. Louise initiated the Kruger National Park Pepperbark Conservation Project 10 years ago, a medicinal plant project that has benefited both people and conservation. Dr. Louise holds a PhD from Wits University that explored ways to share conservation-related benefits more broadly, both for biodiversity and society's sake. With the effects of COVID-19 likely to extend well beyond 2020, this talk will provide critical insights into the conservation challenges that lies ahead for our national parks and how we as SHRs can assist. This project is currently making 7,000 masks sponsored by Conservation Services for distribution to parks around the country. Dr. Louise, I'm handing over to you and looking forward to the talk. Enjoy.
Thanks. Thank you, Francois. So good evening, everybody, and thank you very much for joining us here tonight. I'm looking forward to sharing some of the work that I do with you and something that is certainly one of my biggest passions in life. So I'm going to switch over onto my presentation for tonight, and it certainly is something that I'll be very excited to share with you, and looking forward to getting some feedback from you afterwards as well. So let's look at sharing screen. There we go. So I hope that everyone's had a chance to have a look at the poll, and I see there's been some really nice, interesting responses coming back. So thank you very much for that. And I think just to sort of in a nutshell say that I've got a lot to share with you tonight. Normally sort of pre-January when I gave this sort of presentation, I'd be talking about communities and conservation. But now recently we sort of have to add on this context of the coronavirus that seems to be overpowering much of what we do, certainly in the conservation sector. So I'm going to reflect a little bit on that as well. So before we start talking about communities and wildlife, I just want to take a little bit of a step back. I think we're going to just turn off the video, is that correct? Let's stop the video so that you can see properly. So I think, you know, what we all kind of know and are aware of is that the conservation of biodiversity is really important, and we talk about it all the time. And I think we did a poll earlier that just really reflects that. Thankfully, most of the people on this webinar tonight agree that the conservation of biodiversity is really important. But I think often, you know, one of the things that we don't always think about is why. You know, why is it so important for us to conserve biodiversity? And I'd like to reflect on that a little bit. So I haven't looked at all the chats, but I think some of the things that have been coming through that, you know, for me have sort of reflected some of my own thinking is that really without biodiversity, species wouldn't exist. Everything is linked and everything depends on biodiversity, including man. Biodiversity is important for the survival of species. Ecosystems depend on it. And it's not just important, but it's vital for everything that we do and everything that we believe in. And I think, you know, my reflections on this certainly would be similar to that. And I think really when we talk about the reason we're conserving biodiversity, there's two main things that we need to acknowledge. So there's an intrinsic reason that we're conserving biodiversity as well. And I think often we don't always think about that one too much. So there's an intrinsic reason. Biodiversity has got an intrinsic value. It's not just about the benefits that accrue to people, but of course we conserve biodiversity for all the different benefits that accrue to people as well as to nature. And I think often we also need to remember that life needs life to survive. And I think that's come through in some of the reflections on the chat. And it'll be really nice to have a look at those in a little bit more detail. So I think what we can say is that certainly within this webinar tonight, we have this sort of common vision that the conservation of biodiversity is important. There's an intrinsic reason to do it. There's a moral reason to do it. As humans, we are really the reason that biodiversity is in trouble. So we've got a moral obligation to conserve it. And then of course we want to conserve it because humans benefit from it. So if this is what we're doing, and if this is what we're setting out to do within the conservation sector, it's important that we are able to be sustainable and that we can persist into the future if we're going to be able to achieve these objectives. So persistence and sustainability really has got three main pillars. And you know, we've all kind of heard of this stuff before, but how often we really apply the sustainability principles to conservation is something that I'd like to reflect on a bit more tonight. So it's important that biodiversity conservation and that protected areas are ecologically intact. And I think that's really been the focus of most protected areas since they were established in the early days. But it's also really important that they're economically viable. You know, they have to be able to maintain standards, we have to operate, we have to be able to grow, and that requires money. But then on the left-hand side, you know, it's also really important that we are socially acceptable or socially relevant to the majority of society. And that's not always that easy, and often we take it for granted just because perhaps we as a human or as a family or as a community, you know, really believe in this really strongly, but not everybody does. And I think it's important that we remember that these are national assets that have to be acceptable and seen as relevant by broader society, and that's an incredibly important component of sustainability. Otherwise, these systems really will collapse, and the whole point of sustainability really is that if any one of those arms collapses, then the system will collapse. So most of the work that I do in national parks is on the left-hand side. So looking at those links between human benefits, the distribution of human benefits, and then how that links into making national parks acceptable to society. But just one more note on this slide, and I think it's really important for the sort of context within which I'm going to talk tonight, is that, you know, we've got to look at this stuff within the context of environmental justice. And I think that's really important in a country like South Africa with our history of apartheid, and where we really are trying to build relevance with broader society, not just a smaller group of society, and doing things in a fair and a just way, which they haven't always been done within the context of conservation. And we'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit later on in the seminar. So just to sort of give you a little bit of an overview of what you're in for, I'm going to be talking about three main aspects of conservation. So firstly, I'm going to touch a little bit on the history of Kruger, because I think that really does define where we are going to in the future. So history is really important. I'm then going to talk a little bit about benefits, and that's really the realm that I work in most, is looking at the benefits and how we can distribute and accrue benefits to broader society, and how we can use that as a tool for conservation sustainability. So I'm going to touch on that, and that's really where I'm going to focus on the Pepperbark project and some of the other resource use projects that you may find interesting to learn about tonight. And then lastly, I'm going to sort of talk about this context of this coronavirus pandemic that has really hit us pretty hard over the last couple of months, and how that's really changed the way in which we are thinking about conservation going forward, and how it's changed the way in which we're having to make priorities and decisions on the ground. So let's look a little bit at the history. You know, of course, it's important to remember that humans are part of the Kruger landscape, and they have been for hundreds of thousands of years. And we've known this, you know, through the cultural heritage sites. There's amazing sort of suite of rock art sites in Kruger, both from the Stone Age, early, middle, and late Stone Age, as well as the Iron Age, the Iron Age sites. And on the bottom right-hand side, you can see the Masarini site near Palabora. I'm sure many people are familiar with that. But I think the point really is that this landscape that we know now as the Kruger Park has been lived in by people and used by people for many hundreds and hundreds of years. On the right-hand side, you can see a cultural heritage map. There's over 700 cultural heritage sites in Kruger, and you can see people have been using this landscape, using resources within this landscape for a very long time, and over a large spatial scale as well. And they certainly would have influenced the landscape. Quite interesting, there's some work that was done very long ago, well, in the 80s, by Ina Ploeg, and her work showed that the current complement of animals actually weren't completely the same as those that are found in some of the archaeological records from when the early and middle Stone Age people lived in this environment. So people and wildlife actually evolved together within this landscape, and I think that's quite a fascinating thing to think about when we talk about the drivers of the ecosystem, which often we refer to as fire, as climate and soil and so on, but humans really have been a driver of this landscape as well. So around the 1800s and towards the late 1800s, things started to change, and that was really because there was a lot of hunting going on in the area. There was also the rinderpest outbreak, decimating wildlife and livestock numbers. So by the late 1800s, game numbers were certainly on the decline, and that's really why the sort of precursors to the Kruger National Park in the form of the Shingweti Game Reserve, the Sabi Game Reserve, were established in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. So it was really around establishing these areas so that wildlife would persist, mostly for sustainable yield at the time, which is quite interesting and not something that we acknowledge very broadly anymore. By 1926, things weren't working so well, and it was decided to take a more protectionist approach, and that really was the sort of official promulgation of the Kruger Park. But remembering that was a very protectionist approach that was taken, so sort of fines and fences, people were moved out of the area, wildlife and conservation. It was more of a preservation approach, really. So people were not seen as part of the landscape. And that era sort of persisted right up until sort of the mid-90s when democracy happened in South Africa. Another big watershed of change in the history of Kruger is when the Limpopo National Park was joined onto Kruger in the form of the Transfrontier Conservation Area, adding on 1 million hectares of land. But what was really quite important to acknowledge was that the TFCA had both people as well as biodiversity objectives, and that was really important in terms of how it would then play out going forward. So we've got this very interesting history that I've really summarized in a nutshell, but I think what we need to first acknowledge is that because of this history, we have this magnificent landscape that we all know and love. Those of us that have been privileged to be able to visit the park from very early days, very young days, have certainly grown to love and to cherish this place. The wildlife, the plants and the landscapes are amazing. It's got an amazing tourism product, and it also obviously contributes has got a huge economic impact at a number of different levels. So this is the result of the history, and that's important to acknowledge. But of course, that's not the only result, and Kruger is not an island, as much as some of us would like to sort of protect it like that. But it's not an island. It's actually embedded within a much broader landscape. And actually, it's that broader landscape that makes it sustainable. And I think what's quite interesting, if you look at this map, to just sort of realize that the Kruger has got over 1,000 kilometers of boundary. So that's the first thing. And the boundary is both hard as well as soft boundary. So it's got a soft boundary, all those gray kind of big patches. Those are where the Kruger Park directly abuts some sort of conservation land use. So all of these private reserves over here, all of these mostly hunting reserves on the east in Mozambique, and then of course the Limpopo National Park here in the north. So that is what we would call a soft boundary. Hard boundaries over here around the Shangoni Gate area, where our boundary directly abuts areas that are occupied by lots of people, where lots of people are living and working. Also similar down here, also very hard boundary. So there's a lot of boundary space, a lot of places to protect, but of course it's embedded. We're embedded within this big system, which is really important. Also remembering that people within this landscape are there's a huge diversity of people, and I think there's a huge range of wealth Unfortunately, the majority of people on our western boundary are from lower income households. Out of all 7 municipalities, the unemployment rate is actually higher in all 7 of our municipalities than the national average for the country. So that's quite significant if you talk about benefits and expectations and perceptions of what the Kruger can do for society. So those are really important points when we talk about development and we talk about engagement. It's just the sheer numbers of people that we are sharing this landscape and this space with. So I'm going to talk quite a lot about benefits, and before I do that, I think I just want to make sure that we're all kind of thinking of benefits in the same way. A benefit to us is really any impact to a human that has got some sort of positive outcome on well-being. So it sounds a bit wafty, but what the point is that well-being is a big basket of stuff. It's not just about money. It's not just material or food kind of components. It's also your physical health. It's your social well-being, your spiritual well-being, your emotional well-being. So there's hard and soft components of well-being. So when we talk about benefits, it's that whole big basket of tangible as well as intangible things. And when we talk about impacts of protected areas on people, it's that whole big basket of stuff that we've got to consider, especially when we're hoping to use benefit sharing as a tool for building relationships and for contributing towards the sustainability of conservation. So another important thing about benefits, and it's always quite interesting to me, that benefits are perception based. So you can't tell somebody that they are receiving a benefit if they're not actually feeling it themselves. That's not going to get the kind of result that you're after. So it's a perception based and it's a personal thing, and often something that might be perceived by one group as a benefit might be perceived by another group as a cost. So this is a very simple example. On the left hand side, you might have a tourist experiencing that elephant in a very sort of intangible, aesthetic, positive way as you drive past, and you get this wonderful experience of being close to such a beautiful animal. But then that same animal might be perceived by somebody else at a different space and at a different time in a very direct livelihood cost way, if that elephant trampled this lady's crops, for example. So it's important to remember that these components of biodiversity can impact people in a number of different ways depending on your own kind of system and your own context. So this process of benefit sharing, which is a huge challenge for protected area managers and for Kruger and for SANParks in general, is this process of being able to manage the trade-offs. So you're managing trade-off between costs and benefits, and you're not really trading off the same thing. So you're not trading off money and money. You might be trading off livelihood cost with some sort of aesthetic, intangible benefit. And it's really hard. It's a really hard thing to do and to justify which one is more important. Okay, but it's important to acknowledge that is a process that, that is important to embark on, at least within a protected area and within the protected area management. So quite a lot of text on here, but it's just to highlight that there's a whole stack of benefits and costs that flow from the Kruger Park. And I'll share some resources later and some links to them if you want to get more information about some of these. But they can be summarized in 4 main categories. So there's benefits linked to employment and business opportunities on the top left-hand side. And that will be things like jobs, your SMME support, procurement, preferential procurement, business opportunities, and so on. Your middle block on the left is capacity building benefits. So those would be things like training, research. So all the research that's done would fit under that. Awareness programs, education, environmental education programs, which SANParks does a lot of. I think there's something in the region of 100,000 children that come through our programs every year, in Kruger at least. So there's a lot of that going on. And then there's stuff linked to infrastructure support. We don't do too much of this. Seen a little bit more of this now under the coronavirus pandemic, so service delivery, for example, but then a bit more around educational infrastructure. And then there's a whole lot of stuff linked to ecosystem services. So on the top right-hand side there, you've got a whole lot of things. I'm going to focus a little bit on those provisioning services for the rest of my talk. But before I do that, I also just want to highlight this bottom square. So that's not something we would really call a benefit. So this processes These processes around managing relationships and then restoring rights for people to access opportunities and benefits from protected areas is really important. And that's not really a benefit, but it's seen as something slightly different. So that's things like your land restitution process, any of these new contractual park arrangements, the damage-causing animal programs, promoting access, and so on and so on. So that fits under a separate block. But the point is, you've got all this stuff happening. And if you want to read more about it, we've got it all summarized in this book, and I can send the link for anyone that's interested in that. So I'm going to focus a bit more on the provisioning stuff, which is what I was asked to talk about now that I'm 20 minutes into my talk. And I'm going to talk about these 4 projects briefly. So these are really projects that have been set up to enable people to access benefits that are linked to the harvesting of natural resources from within the Kruger National Park. And they've all got different contexts and different histories and different people participating and all of that sort of thing. But the point is, obviously, these are not the only resources that are used in Kruger. Resources have been used in Kruger since the establishment of the park, but these have been specifically implemented within the context of the history of transformation. So on the top left, we've got the Mapani worm harvesting project. Top right, we've got thatch harvesting, which happens down near Pretoria's Kop area. Bottom left, we've got the Pepperbark project, which is now the rare plant, medicinal plant project, because we're expanding it to other species. And then we've got protein distribution as well. So I'm going to touch on each one of these very briefly. So the Mapani worm harvesting happens in the north of the park, where the Mapani trees grow. Important just to remember, it doesn't happen every year. It only really happens when there's a large outbreak. So that's one of our principles. It's important that we maintain ecosystem integrity. So we only do it when we know that there's a lot of worms. We harvest in a very small area. I think last year when we harvested, it was in the region of 0.02% of the Mapani felt that was exposed to harvesting. And the idea is that there'll be more than enough worms to still continue the life cycle of the Mapani worm. People are given permits to harvest. It's done in a very organized way. Community forums are part of selecting people to participate. The idea is that it's really supposed to benefit the poorer families. And we've had some really nice positive results so far. We started this in 2010. So just some of the stats there, you can have a look. Generally, people harvest about 25 liters of worms a day per person. And if you translate that into monetary value, it's somewhere in the region of just above 550 Rand a day, which in many cases can contribute up to 50% of monthly incomes for some of these households. Most households are actually dependent on social grants only. So that is their only form of income in terms of the households that have participated. Most people are over the age of 40. And, you know, I think that's quite interesting as well, because often, you know, in South Africa at the moment, there's a strong focus on youth. And youth, apparently, to qualify as a youth, you are between the ages of 18 and 35. So I don't qualify as a youth anymore. And it sort of means that there are many people then within society that wouldn't qualify for some of these youth development projects. So this provides another opportunity. The other interesting thing is that it's mostly women that participate, and we don't obviously prescribe who can participate, but this does benefit mostly the women in the local communities. But what we've found, and we've been very privileged to have the opportunity to then engage with many of the people that have participated in the harvesting over the years, through focus groups, through one-on-one interviews, through just talking to people while they're busy harvesting. And we've learned a number of different things. And the bottom line is that we've really learned that it's about so much more than just the worm that people come in and harvest at the end of the day. And what I wanted to share with you is a couple of quotes. So there's 3 kind of main themes of things that have come out that people really have enjoyed. So the first one is around learning. And many people have said that they've really enjoyed learning new things and meeting new people as a result of participating in this. So we've got a chance to get into Kruger. We saw Shangoni, we saw the ranger and where he stayed. People indicated that it's really helped their relationships with Kruger. So we see our relationship as positive. The Kruger's opening up and is changing in comparison to previous times. That's really, really important, that this has been able to happen as a result of such a project. And then in terms of perceptions of Kruger. So before harvesting, I was fearful. People said there were big snakes that eat people. And now I know I need not be afraid of animals there. Having been allowed to enter the park resulted in us seeing the park differently. It enabled us to realize how beautiful the park is on the inside. And so for the majority of people participating, they actually hadn't visited the Kruger before. You know, so that's been a phenomenal impact. And then finally, this has changed the way we think about Kruger. So these are really important things to document, you know, over and above just what people harvest at the end of the day. So we've done this quite systematically, and not to sort of dwell on this too much. And there's a paper that you can look up, or I can send you if you want to read more about that. But going beyond just the material and physical impact on the top left-hand side of your screen, so the thing, you know, food and income, to some of these other things. So the impact on psychological and emotional well-being. So the way the project created a sense of optimism among participants in their communities, a sense of happiness, a sense of hope, and this idea and the positive impacts associated with learning new things was documented as really relevant. And then some of these social impacts were also really interesting. So people loved meeting new people, and that'll be meeting the staff, so meeting the SANParks staff, spending the day out there with the rangers, building new social networks and building the social connectedness with people. And then there were other impacts associated with security as well as freedom of choice. So I think just to sort of summarize with the Mapani worms, it's about improving relationships that we've seen, improving and changing perceptions of people about what actually goes on inside the park, and then promoting this connectedness to land, but not just land, to the people and to the heritage that's inside the park. So these are some of these things that were sort of almost taken away from people because of the history of the park that have now slowly starting to be rebuilt again. Okay, so the bottom line there is that it's not just about the worm, it's about so much more than the worm. Okay, so if there's one take-home message, then take that one away. So let's touch very briefly on protein. This one has received quite a lot of attention in the media over the years as well, but we're quite privileged to have the Skukuza abattoir, which is a registered abattoir, and it allows us to then process and share protein that becomes available for a number of different reasons safely. Okay, this is all in compliance with the veterinary regulations, specifically in the context of foot and mouth. And I can share more information on that if anybody's interested. It's got specific implications for cloven hoof animals and how meat from cloven hoof animals such as buffalo is able to leave the park. So we do this through conservation days. We started in 2016, and we work mostly with the local schools. Remember that many of our schools in the areas next to Kruger fall under what we would call quintile 1 or 2 schools, which are very, very under-resourced schools. And those schools all receive a government subsidy to be able to give the children a meal every day, but very seldom does that meal contain protein. So we use the mechanisms that the schools have in place already to prepare food, and then we just provide protein on an ad hoc basis. We sort of do it through a cycle as we have protein available. And then on those days, we then do a conservation outreach and awareness lecture or program at the school to talk about Kruger and to make sure they know about the free entry permits that the schools can come and visit, and talk a little bit about what goes on in the park and the benefits of conservation and so on. So we call those conservation days that we do at the school, and we're able to do that when we do buffalo offtakes at a very small scale. I think in terms of buffalo, it depends. The offtakes are based on the previous year's census, and it's somewhere in the region of 0.02 to 3% of the buffalo population, and it's also just dependent on the census. Elephant meat, we sometimes get elephant meat available, and this is just through when elephants are controlled as a result of problem animal management inside the park. You can see the map on the right hand side. Each little bubble is representative of a school that's been engaged with through this program over the last couple of years, remembering that each school has got in the region of between sort of somewhere in the region of 400 and 1,300 children. So it's got a massive reach just to sort of provide some visibility with regards to conservation in some of these local areas. Many of these programs, as I might have mentioned, have got unintended consequences, and this is one of them. So if we're doing buffalo, the schools have to send their food preparation people to one of the gates where we meet up with them, and we provide wood and water and a good conversation, and everyone sits around the fire for about 3 hours to cook the buffalo meat so that it can be safe by the time it leaves the park according to the foot and mouth protocols. But this opportunity has provided such a nice environment for having a conversation, once again, about conservation. So there you've got people that prepare food at the local schools, you've got our local section rangers, you've got our field rangers, and they're all talking about general stuff and building these social connections, which are so incredibly important for the sustainability of conservation. So an unintended consequence as a result of having to cook the buffalo meat. So once again, it's not just about the meat, it's about so much more than the meat. And that's really just the thing to keep in mind at the end of the day. So I've mentioned these are under-resourced schools. Some of the feedback from the principals, family members came to our school and encouraged us to build relationships with the Kruger. They feel they want to know more about your place. And this is as a result of their children being part of these programs at school. The parents never thought that their children can benefit from Kruger, so they're very grateful. Hoping that the relationship will grow further, and your presence signaled to the learners the importance of nature conservation. So these are all report backs from various principals. Okay, finally the pepperbark, and I'm half an hour in. So here we go, the pepperbark tree. So for those of you that are not familiar with this tree, it's a sort of a medium-sized tree. It's a very popular medicinal plant, and it's used for a wide variety of ailments, including chest infections and colds and flu. And it's a very successful medication. So it's actually it's a proven expectorant. So it would be on the same sort of line as something like Mucospec that you would buy at a local pharmacy. And traditionally, people have used the bark. The problem is because it's so popular and because it works so well, it's been very much over-harvested in much of its range. It historically occurred all over Southern Africa, but now there's very few trees that are left in the wild. Most trees are within protected areas, and even within protected areas, they are being harvested illegally. So that's a picture there of one of the sort of larger Kruger plants. This was before we started our project at the late, I think it was 2009. And you can see there that illegal harvesting of that bark has taken place quite recently from when the picture was taken. And that'll have quite a severe impact on that tree. So when the bark is removed completely, if a tree is ring-barked, then the crown dies off. It's important to remember these trees are they are multi-stemmed and they coppice very easily. So they're quite resilient to damage. But large-scale damage of a lot of crowns certainly does then eventually result in die-off. The other challenge with the Kruger plants is that we are finding that most of them are propagating vegetatively. So they're kind of propagating from each other. They seem to all be related. There's some work that's been done on the genetics of the plants, and now more recently there's a researcher doing her master's on the sexual reproduction of the plants and looking at how they, produce flowers and produce fruit from that, because there seems to be such a low seed set in these trees. So these are additional challenges that these trees are facing. So we're trying to look at it sort of holistically in terms of saving the plants. But if you want more details on those projects, I can also share them at a later stage. So this is some bark that was harvested in Kruger, part of this big batch that was poached on the left, and that was seized at one of the local markets. So that's what it looks like when it gets sold on the markets, mostly at the pension markets at the end of the month. So what we did is in 2009, we employed rangers because we were like, flip, well, this is looking pretty bad for the pepperbark. We got some funding. We were very lucky to be able to get some funding through the Park Development Fund. And this was primarily funded through the ivory sales that took place in 2009. So we were very fortunate to be able to use another species sustainably to be able to fund the start of this project that has now expanded over the years. So we employed these field rangers, and they've been employed ever since. And their sole objective is to protect these plants. Quite a lot easier than rhino because the plants don't move anywhere and we know where they occur. And so these guys go out there every day and look after the trees, and that's had a massively positive impact. Of course, one of the questions then is, well, if we're protecting these plants, is this sustainable? So who are the users, and how can we then work with the users to promote access to alternative sources of these plants, because that's really, looking forward, is the only way you're going to save a species in the end. So we started working with the traditional healers in 2010, having conversations with them all over, up and down the park, and running workshops, and it turns out that they said that they were very keen to try other sources of pepperbark, and they'd be happy to try some of the nursery grown plants as well. So as a result of that, we started this propagation project. Over time, we've had various sponsors. We've got SAPI to thank quite largely for a lot of the early funding. The Honorary Rangers, we were very grateful to them for also funding some equipment for our field rangers in the field. And then we've also worked quite closely with SANB and with ARC and Nelspruit to get the germination protocols sorted out and to germinate these little plants. And as you can see, we now literally have thousands and thousands of these. And I think many of you have probably got some planted at home. They grow really well. They don't have damaging roots. They're evergreen. They pretty much keep their leaves throughout the winter. And if you just look after them, they are very resilient trees. On the right-hand side, we've got wild ginger, also a very, very popular medicinal plant, and we're expanding this project to include other species such as the wild ginger as well. But I think in terms of the reach, important just to look at that. I mean, look at that geographical impact in terms of all those villages that have now got Warburgias. And this is literally thousands and thousands of Warburgias. So over the last 11 years, we've engaged with all these people living next to the park, all the traditional healers. Over 100 villages have been involved, between 400 healers directly and 3,000 healers indirectly. And we've distributed over 25,000 saplings. So the map on the right is the wild ginger, which we are still battling to grow in bulk, but we are slowly getting there. So it's had a massive impact. Our focus was always on the local sort of subsistence use. And I'll share some pictures over here. Oh, here we go. So this is one of the ladies on the left from one of the villages that got the very early Warburgias when we had them first available. She's on the left, she's getting her little Warburgia there as a sapling. And then this is the same lady 10 years later, and that's her Warburgia on the right. And you can see how amazing it is. This is one of the villages close to Punda, so obviously the environment and the soil and everything is quite conducive to growing the plants. But the interesting thing is that on her own, she started actually supplying the commercial market. So she's supplying the commercial market in Joburg and some of the larger cities with Warburgia leaves. So not only are people now using leaves as opposed to bark, and we've done some research on the reason for that, but they are actually now able to sell the bark on some of these commercial markets, and we're working at ways to try and support them to get their leaves to market so that they actually make some extra cash as a result of doing that. So we're working together with SANB on that sort of second phase of the project now. So it's been incredibly successful. And there's literally hundreds of these trees out in the communities at the moment. So these people that are working with us, these traditional healers, are really important custodians of these rare plants. But once again, it's not just about the plant. So we have these repeat engagements with the traditional healers. We go and visit them. They show us how their trees are growing. They tell us if they're having problems. And in so doing, we build these relationships with the traditional healers that are so important, and that go so far beyond just the simple plant that someone gets at the end of the day. So the last sort of part of my talk is going to focus a little bit about perceptions, and I think it's important to remember that what I've tried to show you is that all of these resource use projects have had an incredibly positive impact both on the people that have been involved as well as on conservation in terms of how people perceive the value of conservation and potentially in terms of their actions towards conservation. But at the same time, there's sort of a bit of a puzzling parallel process going on, and most of this happens over social media. And it's not always positive, so we've seen some very interesting stuff coming out over social media. And I thought I'll just share some of this with you. So some of these quotes that you can sort of read off for yourself are some of the things that people said already in 2010. So, when we started the Mapani worm harvesting, there were people that were furious with this process. Is this a joke? I can't believe this. Kruger's losing focus in a big way. No, SANParks, this is not on. Surely this can't be true. You know, people really felt that this sort of project was really a bad idea. And this was puzzling to us, but then also important for us to acknowledge and then to try and understand. So over the years, we've been doing some surveys, and sorry, I think that's a little bit blurry, but I've been doing using a number of different methods to try and speak to tourists and interview tourists about their views, because it's quite important to put some of the social media perspectives in perspective. You know, because often it can be one loud voice over social media that sort of distorts what the general public is feeling. So we went systematically and interviewed people that were either visiting Kruger or that had visited Kruger, and then we did those over email. And there were a whole lot of statements. We used a Likert scale questionnaire, which is, I've just posted a little snippet of that in there. And it really works on a system where you read a statement to somebody, and then they have to either agree strongly. Those are the two smiley faces that you see over here. So you agree strongly, agree, feel neutral, disagree, sad face, or strongly disagree, two sad faces. Okay, so that's how the Likert scale questionnaire works. And I'm just going to summarize some of that stuff. I've got over 1,210 responses covering probably about 11 different countries now, most of them South African, but also probably about 10 other countries. And yeah, some very interesting responses. I've also got some qualitative data from this as well, and I can share some of that at a later stage. But I think here, just to show you one graph, I've got plenty, but I thought I'll just share one to show you how we plot this sort of information. So each one of these bars represents one of those smiley faces. So this is a double smiley face. So this would be agree strongly, number one. Number two would be just agree. Number three would be neutral. Number four is disagree, so I've put it in red, and disagree strongly. And this is the percentage of respondents on the left. So you can see for this was the very first statement that we put in the questionnaire. Allowing local communities to harvest resources from the park is a threat to conservation sustainability. So most people actually agreed with that. Okay, and that was sort of a baiting question in a way, because it didn't have any context, but that was what we were trying to do. And we then asked this question in a number of different ways and got a whole suite of different results that I can maybe share with you, but I'm just going to summarize some of them quickly. One of the interesting things is that what people did say is that it depends. It depends on how it's managed, and as long as it's sustainable and discreet, then it's okay. So I think at a first glance, people said no, but then they said, well, if it's managed well and it's sustainable, then they're not so uncomfortable. So that's really what we saw. So at a first glance, there were mixed feelings. People felt very much that if it was at a very small scale, it would make them feel more comfortable. So that was also why I was trying to highlight to you around the Mapani worms and the buffalo offtakes, that it happens at a very, very small scale ecologically. People felt more comfortable if they knew that we were monitoring the project. So that was important. So these are all important things so that we know how to tell the stories, so that we don't cause damage, you know, in terms of our PR. Interestingly, people felt just as comfortable about thatch and Mapani worm harvesting as they did with large game. And that was a big surprise. And it turned out from the qualitative data that that was really more linked to people's understanding of culling when carrying, you know, talking about carrying capacities might have been exceeded. So that the sort of general perception that large herbivores often, you know, can result in too many and they can destroy the environment, and then those ones can be taken off. People said that they would prefer not to see the harvesting taking place from the questionnaires. Respondents said that they prefer live to lethal offtakes. But then they also said lethal is okay if there's an ecological reason, but not a social reason. Okay, so not this benefit sharing stuff, that's not good enough in terms of taking animals off lethally. If you do take animals off, it's okay for them to be used for human consumption. And finally, the interesting sort of part of this was that about 10% of the respondents said that they were negative, you know, felt negative about the process. So that's quite different to what we see on social media. And I'm sure some of you follow some of these things, and it looks, sometimes these things go viral and it looks like it's really going badly. But actually, when you ask people that actually visit the park, it actually turns out that it was a lot less of the people that felt negative. But of course, for the last 40 minutes, I've been trying to tell you that everyone's value system is important, and it is. So I spent quite a bit of time with that 10% to try and understand. So these are some of the things that they had to say. And I'm sure many of us can understand some of this stuff. So no, even if I had information, I don't like it. I want this place to be wild. There's people everywhere. This is the only place where there are no people. And I'm afraid of these questions. I visit here for the pureness, and this detracts from it. So these are clearly, you know, world views that see nature and people as being separate. And it's important to understand that. But what this really does is raises this question around wilderness. So what is wilderness? What is wild? What is nature? And who is it really for if it's not for people? And that's really what sort of brings us back to that early question and the poll that we raised at the beginning of this seminar. So if you're interested in this stuff, you can Google that. I've always found this was quite interesting. The title of this paper was "You Can't Fight Feelings with Facts and Start with a Chat," rather. So that's kind of what I think the seminar is also about. It's a bit of a chat. I'd rather be doing it face to face so that we can talk and I can read some body language. But that's really what it's about. If you have disagreements, start talking, have these conversations, and then at least somewhere you can maybe find some common ground. Okay, so then just to remind us, we're in the Anthropocene. We all use resources. Nobody really, you know, if you're watching this webinar, you have either a computer or a laptop or a cell phone, and it means that you're also using resources. So it doesn't matter what you eat or what you wear. A human being on this planet uses resources. So nobody really has the, you know, can sort of take the moral high ground of saying they're anti-resource use. It's really about how you use resources and applying the responsible resource use standards, being economically viable, socially acceptable, and ecologically intact are incredibly important principles to then apply to any type of resource use, be it photographic safaris, be it hunting, you know, whatever. Those principles are the principles that really should apply to all types of resources. So just to end off with some of the COVID-related work, there's been food parcels going out. Obviously, there's been a massive economic impact, especially on the tourism sector. Certainly within SANParks, 80% of our operating budget comes from tourism. So we've had our lifeline cut off, as have many other protected areas and conservation areas and private reserves and so on. So it's been massive. The impact has been massive. It's so much more than just having to wear a mask and have your temperature taken. So there's been lots of action, and a huge thanks to all the sort of sponsors, including from the Honorary Rangers, for things like food parcels and masks and so on. And I'm going to talk just briefly about that. But I think what's important to remember is that, you know, it's a time where nobody is beyond getting this virus, and it's a time that's really drawn all sorts of people together to try and work together to find some common benefits at the end. So we've been working with traditional healers primarily because of the Pepperbark Project. Why traditional healers? Well, I think the important thing to remember is that many of them, you know, 40 million South Africans still rely on traditional medicine for primary health care. So that's a lot of people that are going to be consulting traditional healers when they get ill from the coronavirus. So they are very much at risk. And also the other component to remember is that many traditional healers are elderly, which means that they will certainly be at risk if they contract the virus. And of course, in our context, many of our traditional healers are custodians of some of these incredibly rare plants. They're looking after thousands of plants. They're looking after more plants than we actually have inside Kruger. So they play a really important role in terms of conservation as well. So that's why we identified the healers as a really important group to engage with. And we've been trying to support them through providing personal protective equipment in the form of cloth face masks, hand sanitizers, as well as through awareness material through these brochures. So remember, Kruger's a big place. There's 4 different main language groups next to Kruger. And so we translate all of this awareness material into Venda, Tsonga, Pedi, and Swati, and make that available to the healers. So it's not just in terms of the brochures. We also realize the information keeps changing. And we also realize we can't get out there enough to speak to people and to do face-to-face with them all the time. And also with the lockdown, we realize we're going to have to communicate in a different way. So we were lucky enough to set up a bulk SMS system. We've got lots of traditional healers' contact details through the workshops we've been running over the last 10 years. So we've set up the system, and we now communicate with them in their home language. I've given you an example of one of the English messages, but we communicate with them on a regular basis now with literally thousands of traditional healers next to Kruger. And this has really, enabled us to continue with this relationship building program, even during the coronavirus pandemic. Just to highlight that all the masks that we are using are locally procured, with a great thanks to the Honorary Rangers. So everybody listening, it's been phenomenal. There's no ways we would have been able to do this without the support from the Honorary Rangers. It was a little tiny volunteer group sewing the odd couple of hundred masks in the beginning, and it's expanded out hugely, with thanks, to this additional funding. And just to say that it's been amazing, because we've been able to support local SMMEs in the region of nearly 120,000 Rand. So these are little sewing groups that live next to Kruger, that obviously facing huge food security challenges as a result of the tourism crash. And we've been able to provide them with some of this business. And through this, we've then been able to procure another 140,000 Rand worth of masks as a result, because we've been able to show that the product is good and so on. Also sponsored by the Honorary Rangers. So that's been a massive impact. So some of us might look at that amount and think it's not that much, but I can promise you, to many of these households, that's a huge, the household contribution is massive and significant. So just a very massive thank you to the Honorary Rangers for that. The sanitizer is also locally produced, and we've also procured that in the region of about 160,000 Rand, with thanks to the Honorary Rangers once again. So there's absolutely no way that we'd be able to have done this without your support. So just in terms of the COVID reach for the traditional healers, I'm nearly done. For those of you that need to fill up your glass of wine or maybe your cup of coffee, I'm nearly done. Probably by the end of this, once we finished with our distributions, we would have been able to support over 200 villages, traditional healers from 200 villages, 3,000 traditional healers with this PPE. They represented on 7 different community forums. It'll include 6,000 masks, an additional 7,000 that have then been procured for other SANParks projects. But of course, it's also thousands of hours of satisfaction, of engagement, of relationship building. And really just to finish off with, it's not about the mask. It's not about the mask. It's about the relationships. It's about showing people a bit of humanity at a time of need. And really, it's so easy to link this back into a conservation agenda when we think of that first sustainability slide, and the sort of need to build social relevance among society. So not about the mask. And just to finish off with this quote, this is one of the traditional healers from the north again. We're so happy to get the messages from KNP. So this was before we started with the PPE. It was just the messages, because it means that you remember us. And I just remember this man saying this so deeply to me. It means that you remember us, and being remembered at a time when the world is kind of going crazy it really does count for a lot. Okay, so a huge big thanks to the Honorary Rangers for being able to, respond so quickly to our request for help. Honestly, quite mind-blowing. I never thought it was going to happen. And for enabling this really to get off the ground at the scale at which it's happening, and it's making such a big difference. And we're just very grateful that you've all come and supported us so far along the way. So just to finish, let's remember this Kruger that we all love, and let's just do what we can to support it. We want it to persist. We're going to encourage the youth to come and to build a love for this environment, and to be able to want this environment to persist for their children. And let's be open to different ways of promoting benefits for broader society, so that collectively we really can contribute to the sustainability of conservation. And that's my email address. And all of us in SANParks are very, very open to sharing information and to learning together with people. This is a learning thing. I mean, this is certainly not maths. 1 and 1 does not make 2 in the life of a SANParks scientist. So, we very, very would love to hear from you if you've got critiques, if you've got concerns. If you've got ideas and things, please do not be shy to get hold of me, and yeah, and then we can take it further from there. But thanks for listening. I hope everyone's still there. I have no idea because all I can see is my slide, but I'm going to stop sharing, and then maybe there's a little bit of time for some questions and answers.
Thank you, Louise. We are indeed here and struck with awe and quietness, and it was really a great presentation. Thank you very, very much. There was one of the slides that particularly touched on my side, was the one from the benefits on the park and the cost flowing from the Kruger. And I'm sure that some of the members have also found that interesting. We do have some questions that have come through. I would like to start off with the first one, which was from Herman Bloemhoff, which came through on email. Will it be beneficial to plant such trees in our suburban gardens? And I think you've probably answered part of that. He says he lives in Montana Park in Pretoria, but think to relocate to a plot nearby. And he just asking a few questions around whether obviously it will work in Pretoria. If it is a bird attractive tree, how high does it grow? And if planted, must one be careful of sewage pipes and garden house walls, roots, a problem or not? If you could maybe just give Herman some indication there for his tree that he would like to plant in Pretoria.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for that question. So firstly, absolutely, and you know, we can definitely help you if you're looking for saplings. We've got plenty, so we'll be able to put you in touch. If you're looking to grow some, we can put you in touch with people with seed. And they actually grow really well in Pretoria, funnily enough. So there's quite a lot of them, and you might even find there's quite a few honorary ranges that have got. There's actually there's a couple of little orchards, and then there's also there's a tree. There's one of the roads in Pretoria that's lined with Warburgia. I don't think I'm going to say the name of the road, but there is actually, if you keep your eyes open driving on Pretoria, you'll suddenly see them popping up all over the place. So yes, I can definitely encourage you to plant them at home. And if we can, you know, they certainly are not, they're not creepers, you know, they don't damage infrastructure and so on. So they would be quite a safe one to plant.
Thank you. I see there's some answers coming through on the chats that says they've got one in Kempton Park, and some others are coming through on the East Rand. Next question came in from Keith Newham. He says, how does conservation set about addressing the human explosion and impact on ecosystems? I would imagine in earlier times the balance between the humans and the impact in ecosystems was more in balance than it is today. We seem to be battling with less space for wildlife while trying to balance the equation with an ever-growing demand for humans at a global level. Do you think that there will be a time when conservation starts addressing this side of the equation? If so, when?
Yeah, sure. That's the sort of elephant in the room question, really. And as a mother of 3 children, I always find it a bit awkward to talk about population because I have 3 kids myself, you know, of sort of contributing. But I think what's really important is that we've got to, you know, this idea of building value is really the critical thing. So we've got to make sure that we are valuable. So conservation areas have to be seen as valuable. And by valuable, it doesn't mean pay. If you pay, it stays. It's not about money. It's about all these other things. And I think we've got so much, there's so much more that we can do. We can't, you know, we're not going to be able to change the sort of situation in terms of population, but we can do a lot better with a lot of other things already. So I don't think we're at the point yet where we've done everything we can and now we're sitting, well, there's a lot more that we need to do better before we even go there. But I think, yeah, I mean, resources are running out. We all have to be more responsible in everything that we do. And I don't know, it's a really difficult one, but I would actually love to chat to you a little bit more about that. So if you wouldn't mind sending me an email and we can be in touch, then maybe we can talk a bit more about that.
Great, and he had also a bit of a follow-up on that question, Louise. He said, further to my original question, do you believe current conservation projects and approach, with all the excellent results that you are getting, will it be able to scale up in line with the demands on protected areas and biodiversity in general outside of the limited areas? So not only around Kruger Park.
Yeah, so look, I've painted a nice picture, and I think that was what my objective was with that benefits report, was to just tell the story of what we are doing. We're not saying we're doing it perfectly, and we're not saying we're doing enough, but that is what we're doing because we hadn't told that story before. So we're doing quite a lot, but there's a lot more that we need to do. And I think that some of these things, so some of the sort of fundamental changes that we are trying to do now is trying to do sort of move more towards ownership. So that's really where we understand from Southern Africa, from Zimbabwe, from Zambia, from some of the other examples in Namibia, that ownership is incredibly important for value. And that's something that in South Africa we haven't really been able to explore too much with that. And that's really where, through the land claimant and the land restitution process, we're trying to look at ways that we can share ownership. Because that's really, I think, is going to be one of the leverage points going forward, and that's what we've got to look at that.
Thank you, Louise. And then Richard Jones came in and he said, I heard that the problem elephants in India are deterred from destroying crops by planting very hot chili species. Has this been tried in KNP?
Yes, so there's a protocol for human wildlife conflict in Kruger, so for the problem animal control, and there's a whole lot of things that the rangers have to do first before they get to the last sort of phase, level 5, where they eventually land up shooting an elephant. So it's got to do with sound, noise, deterrence, and chasing the animals away and all that sort of thing. So there's a whole process that goes through. I think there's 3 or 4 things that they have to do before they actually land up shooting. They only land up shooting the recurring offenders. So they actually, I think they call them serial offenders. So once they get classified as a serial offender, then they go to level 5. The chilies, there has been a little bit of research done on that by some of the research groups, but I also know Elephants Alive, based here in Hoedspruit, have done a huge amount of research on all those different ways of deterring. So they've looked at creosote, they've done the chilies, they've done a lot of work on the bees, the wire meshing around the trees, the stone packing, and they've got a very, very nice report. So if anybody would be interested in that, they've got a very nice table where they've set out the pros and cons of those different mechanisms in terms of cost, in terms of time, and in terms of effectiveness. So they've done lots of work on that. I can't report specifically on all the outcomes. I think that their conclusion really is the bees are probably the one with the most effective at the lowest cost with the highest mutual benefits, because then you can harvest honey.
Great. That's great. And then a question from Mohammed Mullah. He says, it's so encouraging to hear of the positive relationships and perceptions created by these projects. What else is being done to introduce surrounding communities to the KNP experience on a more larger scale?
Thanks for that question. I think it's also incredibly important. Access, this idea of access. So I think, we're trying to go beyond just the school programs. So the school programs, there's lots of schools that come in. There's, and of course, those are allowed, the schools that come in get free entry. Often a barrier to the schools is having the resources to be able to get transport to then bring the children to come in. We've got a number of different programs that then support them in terms of transport. So, but then of course you can only support fewer. So it's almost like with the environmental education stuff, you've got a trade-off between quality versus quantity. So when you get kids, so you can facilitate access by providing transport for a smaller group of kids, but then you can provide a longer program versus some of the other programs that only provide a short 1-hour program, but then they get a much less, sort of a less deep experience. There's a number of programs around promoting access for traditional authorities, so they get free access, they get permits that they allowed to use to come in for free for themselves as well as the council. And then any local communities can approach their community forum that we work very closely with 7 different community forums next to the park, and they're able to, through their forum, get permits to come in and visit and to access the park. So that's all in terms of visitation access. And then there's some other programs where we try and provide access for certain groups. So the traditional healers, sometimes if we're at a workshop and they say that they've never been into Kruger, then we allow, we arrange transport and take them on a game drive, for example. And then there's other sort of programs that try and allow people or facilitate access for people for preferential procurement opportunities and those types of access. So access to opportunities to economic benefits as well. But there's a lot of that stuff is all summarized in that Biodiversity for Society book. So if you like, I can also put the link up, or I can share it with Francois and you can download that. There's a lot of information in there as well. But if there's ideas of things that we need to do more, I mean, I think, you know, cost is always a factor. But I think where there's a will, there's a way, and there's actually been an incredibly remarkable increase in the number of local visits to the Kruger Park over the last 10 years. So that's very positive to see.
Definitely. I think what we'll do, Louise, if with your permission, I think what we'll do is we'll spread the link to that book of yours, so that everyone could have access to that. I've got two more questions that came up. One from Francois Kloppers. From the Boerland. He's asking, is the pepperbark tree found only in certain areas of KNP, and if so, where? And if you answer, could be without prejudicing the areas.
Yeah, sure. So in Kruger, it's only found up in the north near Punda. So you'll get that, that's open access information that would be available on the SANB red list. You'd see a little blob around the Punda Maria area. But then outside the park, there's a couple of little patches there. There's a couple of patches around the Hoedspruit area on Mariepskop, and then also down in the south as well. Yeah, so in Kruger, it's just at the Punda Maria camp.
Right, and then last question then from Willie Pinar. Are the SHRs involved in these projects, especially interfacing with the communities? If not, how can we get involved?
Yes, well, that's very nice. Thank you for that question. And so up until now, I think the Honorary Ranger involvement with the Pepperbark project has been through the nursery. I know that a lot of Honorary Rangers have supported Michelle in the nursery, and then through the funding, but not actually in terms of the outreach and the awareness sort of stuff. But I certainly think, you know, where there would be a lot of potential is with these school visits. So the schools can't always come to Kruger, and the logistics of that is not always possible. And especially now with the COVID pandemic, so there might be some opportunities for us to look into that if people would be interested. So we could maybe consider some of those sort of ideas about going to schools and seeing if we can take Kruger out there, and maybe even sort of hook that up with some of our meat distribution programs as well. So if there's people that are interested in that, we can maybe look at that. But any ideas, do let me know, and we can always see what would be possible. We always value the support, and you know, we'll be very interested to get help, because as I pointed out, you know, as you expand these projects and you engage with more people, it's great, but then you land up not being able to maintain the relationship. So often when I give these talks, I say, okay, who's in a relationship? Put up your hand. And it can be with your dog or your pet, or you know, or your gran or whatever. But if you're in a relationship, is it a once-off engagement? No, it's a multiple engagement. So if your objective as a conservation area is to build and maintain relationships with people, you've got to invest the resources into your human resources that enables you to maintain those relationships, which means ongoing engagement with people. And that's really one of the big challenges. So if we can somehow sort of work with you on that, that would also be very, very useful.
Thank you for that, Louise. And then one quick one that sneaked in on the chat. Do elephants feed on these trees?
So they're quite bitter. So those of you that have got them, and those of you that have tried them, you'll see they don't taste great, and so they don't get impacted by insects. Interestingly enough, they never have a problem with that. But they are impacted by elephants, not a lot, and we haven't had huge problems with it in Punda Maria. But there are definitely some areas where they have been knocked over and tried. I would say maybe tried. So I wouldn't say that they don't, but it's certainly not a preferred species. They're evergreen though. So I think in the times of a drought, you might find that, you know, some of the animals might just look and give it a bash, but probably good for their sinuses anyway.
Thank you, Louise. Thanks, Doctor, for everything, and thanks for answering all the questions. And if there's more questions, members are welcome to send them to our email address. And then thank you for our viewers for your participation tonight. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and your company, as well as having a cup together. Should you wish to donate to the SHRs, please use the SnapScan QR code, which will show at the end of the webinar, and it's also on our webpage.